All right, so I'll share my screen and please just indicate when you can see it in full screen mode.
It's coming.
How's that? Can everyone
Yep.
see?
It's there
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre for the opportunity to present my research today. The topic I'm speaking on is the relationship between traditional owners and local governments in Queensland, and what opportunities and barriers exist to improved local decision making based on traditional owner knowledge. So I want to acknowledge the Kabi Kabi people, the traditional owners on the land where I'm zooming in from today, and pay respect to their elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners in the Torres Strait and in Southeast Queensland for their contribution to this research. So today I will speak for roughly 25-30 minutes, which will hopefully give us a lot of time for questions and discussion. And it's really important that I get to all of your questions as this topic is relevant to all of us. We all live in local communities and interact with local governments on a daily basis. Understanding the relationship that local governments have to traditional owners is key to forming a critical lens to current practices and really being able to comprehend possibilities to improved local decision making for the benefit of all. So it is really important for us to share what is happening in our local communities. Um, just to disclose as well, I've de-identified the traditional owner community in Southeast Queensland for this presentation, as I discuss some political dynamics that are of a sensitive nature to both local government and traditional owners. So I have not published any of these findings, and I'm not actually sure that I will, but I'm happy to discuss them in this forum. So this presentation is based on a study I conducted from 2019 to 2022, in which I looked at the relationship between local governments and Indigenous institutions in Queensland. Local government is often an overlooked level of government, but as I will discuss in this presentation today, there are many areas of intersecting interest between traditional owners and local government. And presently, the recognition and representation of traditional owners' interests and rights are lacking in local council decision making, which is further marginalising traditional owners in their own communities and really missing crucial opportunities to improve our local communities by using locally derived knowledge which has been refined over tens of thousands of years. So firstly, some context to this study. In Queensland, there are two forms of local government. There are local councils and Indigenous councils. They are both legislated under the Local Government Act 2009. But in terms of their history, the context in which they operate, and their services that they provide to their communities, they are vastly different. So there are 61 local councils in Queensland, and they operate from Brisbane City all the way to Cape York and west to Mount Isa. I characterize local councils as mainstream. Their main focus is on the three R's: roads, rates, and rubbish, but with also expanding responsibilities in environmental management, economic development, and community well-being. Historically, local councils have had very little to do with Indigenous communities, uh, and this reflects the broader legacies of colonial governance in Australia and the ways in which Indigenous peoples were excluded from decision-making processes that affect their lives, their lands, and their cultures. Today, this is reflected in the low representation of Indigenous peoples in local councils in Queensland, and the even fewer traditional owners on local councils that operate on their ancestral homelands. So in the 2020-2024 council term, there were only 14 Indigenous peoples elected to local councils throughout Queensland, and only three of those were traditional owners. Um, the creation of Indigenous councils in Queensland is tied to a history of paternalistic control. Most of these Indigenous councils were established in the late 20th century, and they replaced earlier systems of direct state administration over Indigenous reserves and missions. So while this transition marked a step toward local control, they did not emerge from a process of self-determination. It was rather a capitulation of the state government to Commonwealth legislation, such as the Racial Discrimination Act, and the continued lobbying of Indigenous groups for reforms in discrete Indigenous communities. So today there are 16 Indigenous councils that operate across mostly remote parts of Queensland, and they deal with numerous challenges like chronic underfunding, resource constraints, and an ever expanding list of responsibilities. Indigenous representation to Indigenous councils in the 2020-2024 council term was 100%. Every councillor was Indigenous, and with the majority of those being traditional owners. So, what is fundamental to understanding the relationship between traditional owners and local governments are how Indigenous institutions are positioned in this system. Uh, Firstly, what are Indigenous institutions? They are the systems of established and embedded social rules that structure social interactions. They include, but are not limited to, country and kinship, which are fundamental pillars in Indigenous societies. An Indigenous person's identity is deeply rooted to kinship ties and a connection to country. Country refers not only to the physical landscape to which an individual is linked to through kinship, but also to sacred sites and the traditional laws associated with ancestral lands. Um, when Indigenous people speak of country, they are referring to their place of origin, their cultural identity, their spirituality, and their language group. Indigenous societies are grounded in both immediate and extended family networks, underpinned by intricate kinship systems. So in Australia, Indigenous tribal groups are typically defined by geographical boundaries that delineate their respective nations, yet remain interconnected through marriage, ceremonial exchange, trade, um, and historical ritual conflict. Indigenous institutions are crucial and relevant to how Indigenous communities govern, make decisions, select leadership, care for country, and manage relationships with people, land, and the environment. In Queensland law, Indigenous institutions are defined and recognised as Aboriginal tradition and island custom, and reference to Indigenous institutions appears in numerous pieces of Queensland legislation. So, recognition in Queensland law, advancing the purpose of these acts includes recognition of Indigenous institutions and fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples, namely traditional owners, to be involved in decision making relevant to their cultures and values. So the Local Government Act in Queensland includes a provision to allow local governments to take account of Indigenous institutions, both Aboriginal tradition and island custom. But what that means in practice raises questions about how and why this particular provision is included in law. So firstly, why is it phrased as a discretionary power, an option rather than a directive? And what structural barriers exist to the full recognition of Indigenous governance structures in local policy? What is included in the Planning Act is fundamental to advancing the key purpose of that legislation. But town planning, urban planning, has neglected to include Indigenous voices in the processes of planning, and more egregiously, ignored traditional owners' interests. If this is to change, an important question must be asked. Is there a risk that valuing and promoting culture becomes tokenistic rather than empowering? As planners, at their own admission, have very limited understanding of Indigenous culture and what connection to country means. The Environmental Protection Act places Indigenous peoples alongside industry as key stakeholders and clearly fails to recognize that Indigenous peoples have fundamental responsibilities as traditional owners that are embodied by their cultural institutions. The Human Rights Act includes some of the strongest recognition of Indigenous institutions in Queensland law, especially as it relates to traditional owners' connection to country, and what implications this legislation has for increased Indigenous rights recognition at the local government level is really unknown and untested. It is, however, a good step in embracing elements of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, into law and recognizing the importance of country to Indigenous peoples. Australia's endorsement of UNDRIP in 2009 marked a symbolic step forward for the country. But we really shouldn't ignore that Australia initially opposed UNDRIP in 2007, along with Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, which is really reflective of Australia's general position towards Indigenous rights recognition, which was also highlighted in the Voice to Parliament referendum outcome as well. So, although Australia has endorsed UNDRIP, we have actually done very little to implement the declaration into law. Uh, the current recognition of Indigenous rights is largely piecemeal, a point emphasised by the Law Council of Australia in 2024. At the local level, this hesitation significantly weakens the potential for meaningful recognition of Indigenous rights. Um, and while some local governments and Indigenous communities have taken proactive steps towards self-determination and co-governance, partnerships, agreement making, these efforts often lack consistent legal backing or national support. So without full incorporation of UNDRIP principles, uh, particularly those relating to free, prior, and informed consent, land rights, and cultural autonomy, local recognition remains vulnerable to political shifts at the local and state level, and administrative discretion that is uh, like what is seen in the Local Government Act. So the question then arises, what hope is there for increased recognition at the local level? Um, the answer may lie in sustained grassroots advocacy, policy innovation by progressive local councils, and growing public support for Indigenous justice. But without national leadership that commits to integrating UNDRIP in full um, into legislation, progress will continue to be uneven, and Indigenous rights will remain inconsistently recognised across Australia. So this table presents a very generalized depiction of the intersection where traditional owner and local government interests meet. I've highlighted some of the key areas in which this relationship has relevancy for local decision making. So in terms of environmental management, traditional owners have cultural obligations to care and maintain country and to ensure it is used sustainably for future generations, while local governments are legislated under Queensland law to manage the environment, mostly through Western modes of management. Protecting, preserving, and accessing sacred sites is important for traditional owners as it underpins the continuation of culture and cultural practices. In Queensland, there are two Indigenous Cultural Heritage Acts, and local councils play an important role in identifying Indigenous cultural heritage and working with traditional owners to include sites in planning schemes, and in some cases signed and preserved for public access. Traditional owners have their own unique processes for assigning or selecting leadership, and generally it is these individuals who are key to decision making at the local level. And local governments obviously hold elections for the public to run as candidates for council, and these elected representatives make crucial decisions about their communities, some which have immense impact, such as approving large-scale development. Uh, Councils often make decisions that are very uh, unpopular with certain segments of the public, and there are numerous cases across Australia which highlight misalignment between public visions for their communities and local council decisions. And it is arguable that the concept of sustainability has origins in Indigenous knowledge and communities. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have long enduring cultures and societies, which can be attributed to the practices that have formed around sustainable use of the environment, such as seasonal hunting and harvesting, as well as management of biodiversity through totemic relationships. So that brings me to the two cases for this study. I looked at two areas of Queensland uh, for this project. In the Torres Strait, I included both local government types, local and Indigenous councils, and the Torres Shire Council and the Torres Strait Regional Council, and one local government area in southeast Queensland. So in the Torres Strait Island region, there are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owner communities. In southeast Queensland, there are Aboriginal traditional owner groups. Population and Indigenous population proportions are significantly different in both areas. In terms of Indigenous representation on council, every electable position in the Torres Strait was occupied by an Indigenous person, and most of those were traditional owners, whereas the Torres Strait Council had full Indigenous representation, but none of those Indigenous people were traditional owners to that area. In the local government in southeast Queensland, there were no Indigenous or traditional owners on council. There is native title in both regions, both exclusive and non-exclusive possession native title. And as an indicator of reconciliation, local governments in the Torres Strait did not have reconciliation action plans, while the local government in southeast Queensland had one, but it was not endorsed by Reconciliation Australia. Rather, it was that local council's independent version of a reconciliation action plan. So the key findings of this study. Firstly, it is widely recognised that the Torres Strait is overgoverned. There are state government agencies, three local governments, including the Northern Peninsula Area Regional Council, which operates on Cape York. There is a Torres Strait Regional Authority, which is a Commonwealth statutory body that implements and oversees regional programs and services. There are 21 native title bodies and a peak body for native title bodies. So in this context, local and regional decision making sits squarely with government, which has limited capacity building opportunities for traditional owners through their native title bodies. Although there is high representation of Indigenous people on councils in the Torres Strait, there is meager recognition of Indigenous institutions in decision making. And this is reflected in decisions made by the Torres Shire Council to develop a portion of Prince of Wales Island against the wishes of the Kayardild traditional owners. Development was halted due to a federal court injunction sought by the traditional owners, and that project was eventually abandoned. Um, and with the Torres Strait Island Regional Council, council decision making is often affected by conflict of interest disclosures, with councillors having to recuse themselves from voting on issues due to a perceived conflict. Um, so in both of these cases in the Torres Strait, council decision making does not recognise the interconnected web of kinship in that region. In Southeast Queensland, the situation is very different. Uh, Partisan politics is very much a factor in local decision making, and the public perceives council to be affected or influenced by state and federal politics to the detriment of local decision making. So some councillors shared with me that council was split along partisan lines. In my research, I found that many councillors for this local government had run as party candidates at state level elections, and the mayor at the time was directly campaigning for a Liberal candidate to a local state seat, despite her sitting as an independent, non-partisan mayor. So the traditional owners have really benefited from working with the state Labor government over many years. Queensland Labor at the time supported the traditional owners' vision for their community, but with a change to LNP last year, there may be uncertainty now for traditional owners in terms of realising certain ambitions. So it is important to note that the LNP government committed to scrapping treaty in Queensland within a week of the Voice to Parliament referendum decision. Um, so in the local government, in this local government, sorry, in Southeast Queensland, there are no Indigenous councillors and only a few traditional owners working in council in roles with no decision-making authority. Traditional owners and local government have what I would describe as an adversarial relationship. This is mostly because traditional owners are able to hold council to account for commitments made in their Indigenous land use agreement. There is also tension due to the overlay of other political dimensions influencing local politics. So barriers. The legacy of exclusion and control influences how local governments operate today. And this legacy has the greatest impact on traditional owners who are often marginalized by councils and constrained by mainstream regulations within councils. So current current representative models do not work for traditional owners. Local governments struggle with recognition of Indigenous institutions and clearly ignore Section 9(3) of the Local Government Act. When exercising a power, local government may take account of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander custom. And local governments are threatened by Indigenous assertions of sovereignty, as it really challenges their local authority and decision-making powers, especially as it relates to land planning and development. Councils are the third tier of government in Australia and are susceptible to state territory administration over their affairs. So in Queensland, following an investigation uh, back in the late 2010s into local council corruption, reforms were instituted and local governments were placed under much closer scrutiny. So it is in this context that local governments experience uncertainty in their position as local authorities and treat traditional owner authority as a potential instability to their legitimacy. Traditional owners need to be empowered to leverage existing Indigenous rights frameworks to pursue greater recognition of their rights in local government. Um, this looks to go beyond just consultation and extend into active decision-making roles in planning, in land management, and in development processes that affect traditional owner country. So local governments should embed structured and ongoing partnerships with traditional owner groups, recognizing their authority as traditional owners with localized knowledge that goes back tens of thousands of years. This could take the form of joint planning committees, Indigenous advisory bodies, or formal recognition of cultural land management practices within local policies and strategies. There's also a growing traditional owner corporate structure at the local regional level that are interacting with councils on a daily basis. And it is this intersection where there are opportunities to really reframe relations. Um, at last count, nearly every local government area in Queensland had some form of either native title claim or determination. And native title bodies could be vehicles for change at the local level, but they need funding and resources to do so. So what I'm proposing is really a reimagining at the local level. Structural change to local government functions could be enabled through adoption of or alignment to principles of UNDRIP, especially around governance related to decisions about land and land use. Changes to representation need to occur as well to enable greater traditional owner representation on councils. This could be through candidate mentorship programs like they've run in New South Wales before, or dedicated representation for traditional owners on council, much like what the Weipa Town Authority possess. So agreements need to guide and reframe relations at the local level as well. And to do this, a process of truth-telling should precede any future agreements to ensure parties are fully cognizant of past and ongoing injustices that undermine improved relationship building. Traditional owners need funding to develop capacity to take their places as rightful decision makers in their communities. Traditional owner knowledge is crucial to the futures of our local and regional communities. Systems of knowledge which have been refined over tens of thousands of years, which include vital information that will hopefully enable us to make decisions that can respond to challenges around climate change, food security, urbanization, and environmental degradation. And that's it from me. I welcome any questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bart. That was amazing and so comprehensive. Are there any questions for Bart at this point? While we wait, I might ask a question, Bart. You mentioned that town planners have traditionally not understood and implemented Indigenous decision making in planning and everything. And given that we train town planners at UniSC and other universities, what recommendations would you have for the forthcoming generations of town planners in terms of preparing them to engage with Indigenous groups and traditional owners?
Yeah, I'm not sure within the discipline what can be done, but I know there's been a lot of steps taken to embed a lot more Indigenous knowledge and engagement in the courses that are available, especially now that recognition is a requirement under law in Queensland, and it's becoming more prevalent across other jurisdictions as well. But yeah, I would just like to add as well, like planning agencies, whether at local or state level, they need to better recognize traditional owner knowledge to really guide development of new suburbs, um, and to really be more considerate of local biodiversity as well.
Mm.
I've heard countless times traditional owners say things like, they shouldn't be building here. That's a natural fire corridor or a floodplain, or,
Yeah.
there is a species of plant or animal that is endemic to the area, and crucial to local biodiversity, or council is not protecting or promoting our traditional and cultural heritage. And these are all issues which not just affect traditional owners, but affect our local communities.
Mm.
Um, and I'm assuming most of us here today live in or, at least travel to Southeast Queensland and, uh, acutely aware of the rapid pace of development with new
Mm.
suburbs popping up across the region.
Yeah.
Um, if you've spent some time in these areas, you're likely to notice a real lack of what I would consider thoughtful planning,
Mm.
whether it's, limited green spaces or poor connectivity, or just they seem out of place with our natural landscape.
Yeah.
Uh, so, I mean, there's all sorts of implications of uh, not including traditional knowledge in planning and development. Uh, and when we develop without consideration for, natural historical values,
Mm.
we risk erasing important cultural features, or disrupting ecosystems. And, these will have potentially serious social, environmental, and economic implications down the track.
Yes, absolutely. Particularly with fire corridors and floodplains. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I see Shannon has his hand up. Shannon, would you like to ask a question?
Thanks for that, Bart. It was really comprehensive. You mentioned in there about the change in the state government and how it was potentially more productive with the Labor government. I was just wondering, do you have other examples of, I guess, better and worse forms of government, either state, federal, or even local? Maybe good examples where the relationships have been more productive, and I guess what was it about those that was more successful?
Yeah, the most clear example in that context is the Victorian state government. Um, and I guess you could just put it down to that, Victoria being more socially progressive in that regard. I mean, they've actively engaged in a agreement making process under their own state-based legislation, the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, which was enacted in 2010, which has created a whole system which kind of bypasses native title and it allows traditional owners to really expedite a land claims process and then engage in some form of negotiated agreement making with the state government directly. That's really allowed improved relationship building between traditional owners in Victoria and the state government. And now that they've implemented a whole treaty framework and are, about to begin negotiations with traditional owners in Victoria, I mean, Victoria, you would have to say is head and shoulders above other jurisdictions here in Australia.
Absolutely. Vinati, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. But that was very, very informative. Um, Statistics and research show that a lot of the Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people live in urban areas, cities and towns. What would be their involvement and how can they be involved in the decision-making process related to land management, connection to country, and those sort of things?
That's a very good question. And that is a fact that most people are unaware of, is that most Indigenous people live in urban areas, whether it's major cities or uh, inner regional cities and towns. And in those communities, a lot of traditional owners have remained on their country, and a lot of them do not have any recognised form of land rights or recognition of their rights as traditional owners. So normally, or I shouldn't say normally, but in other contexts, more outer regional and remote, traditional owners have been able to engage with local governments or planning agencies through requirements under the Native Title Act. But for traditional owners in urban centres, they don't have that same leverage, I would say, that same ability. So what we've seen is that traditional owners living on whether it's cities or major regional centres have been able to form their own organisations or corporations without necessarily having that land base, and been able to lobby the government directly for their rights in decision making, whether it's through laws around planning, around environmental management, or cultural heritage. So some traditionalists have still been able to mobilise in that way, but I recognise it's significantly more challenging for them because they've been so more comprehensively dispossessed than other traditional owners in regional and remote areas.
Thank you.
Rachel, you've got a question.
Yeah, but look, thank you so much. So much of what you've spoken about is really resonating with my lived experience at the moment of working in partnership with the Sunshine Coast Council to develop a First Nations creative arts strategic plan, which was a request of traditional owners and the First Nations community on the Sunshine Coast through council to develop that as what the council has positioned as a sub-plan of the arts plan within the local government area of the Sunshine Coast. And now we're sort of trying to reconcile the colonial structures of local government area and creative arts plan as a First Nations arts as a sub plan of the broader arts plan, when actually the two traditional owner groups that we're working with would view arts as much more overarching and embedded and connected to culture and cultural vitality. And while there is overlap in the geographical boundaries, there's far more complexity in traditional owners, people who identify as Kabi Kabi but are not on the native title plan, and then First Nations people from other places who now live here and make their livings as artists. So it just really, everything you're speaking about today really kind of resonates with that experience. And I was just wondering if you, I guess, have any thoughts on those kind of council collaborations where there's been an effort to make connections with the traditional owners and First Nations community and to work in partnership, and how the complexities of all of that might be navigated.
Yeah, I think it's really important, even though there's not a lot of emphasis on this happening at the state level now due to change of government. The Liberal National Party are not supportive of this type of arrangement. That doesn't mean local governments cannot engage in their own process of truth telling or some form of negotiation or agreement making with traditional owners at the local level. Traditional owners, other Indigenous people, and people who have been removed or dispossessed, or traditional owners who don't agree or want to engage with the native title process based just on principle. So I think it's really important for local governments to engage in a local truth-telling process to fully understand what impacts have occurred to Indigenous people in that area, to Indigenous people and traditional owners, based on past and present policies and what effect that's having on current political dynamics between those different communities as well. There really needs to be some form of understanding from council before they engage in any sort of meaningful relationship building around any priority that council's placing on. Yeah, I think that's really important that, local councils do have that, although that, they're governed by the state and territories, whatever, but they still have that latitude to go and engage in these processes at their own discretion. And I think it's important that they do so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Renee, you've got a question.
Hi, Bart. Thank you for your presentation. Really important work. Similar to Rachel, some of the challenges you spoke about, I really resonate with and have experienced myself. As researchers or public sector employees, of which I am both, often the way in which we engage community is through structures like PBCs, local governments, RCHOs. And when the challenges like the ones you described exist, what happens sometimes is that there is difference in opinions when you're looking for those community-led solutions about what that solution is. And that's a challenge that I've experienced working with some of the remote communities in Queensland, particularly the Torres Strait, due to that level of over-governance. And I was wondering, I don't really have a question, but I was more wondering if you have advice around how to navigate those dynamics so that we can be confident in representing the majority view of community when we say we're doing a community-led solution, if there is some differences in opinions. And apologies if you covered it in the first part of your lecture. I was about 15 minutes late, but I was wondering if there's been previous efforts by the Queensland government to streamline that community governance mechanism through things like local decision-making bodies, and if you have any reflections on the effectiveness of those structures.
I don't really have a good answer for you, to be honest. I know that the Queensland government has engaged in a whole community approach to planning in the Torres Strait before, but how successful that has been, I'm not too sure. And they do that for a number of reasons because, traditional owners at the end of the day have and should have final say over what happens to especially decisions around land and land management. But we also have to be aware that a lot of Indigenous people have been moved by force in the past. So they have, generations of Indigenous people have been brought up in other traditional owner communities and have been accepted, and they have a level of, I guess, decision making as well in respect to traditional owners. But in terms of what government can do to really sort of understand this process a bit better was and they've now shelved it, is the truth-telling process. We need to understand what impact this has had on communities before we can engage in any meaningful way. And I would really strongly advocate for a return back to truth-telling. And I think the Queensland government, out of all the jurisdictions here in Queensland, is probably the most wanting of this process, because right now, unfortunately, we're headed in the wrong direction.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. So one of our adjunct professors in our centre, Auntie Sue Stanton, who's a traditional owner in Kingarakan country in the Northern Territory, is running for mayor for the Litchfield local government area. I just wondered if you knew how many Indigenous mayors we have around Australia or in Queensland. I'm guessing not many, but I'm curious.
Yeah, well, in Queensland, all of the Indigenous councils would have an Indigenous mayor in this council term, and then some of the other councils in the Northern Territory and Northwestern Australia would also have Indigenous mayors. I think another important question is how many Indigenous CEOs are also working within councils, because the CEOs have a lot of decision-making power within council. That's something that's not always recognised. And I know of very few Indigenous CEOs at present. I could probably count 2 or 3 here in Queensland. So that's why I really think there needs to be a fundamental shift in how the local council is structured, especially around recognising Indigenous rights, namely traditional owners' rights, and that what we have in law here in Queensland provides some latitude for that, but I think by recognising and incorporating UNDRIP fully into law at the national level will compel state, territory, and local governments to enact laws and policies that are consistent with how Indigenous rights should be recognised.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up question. Do you see any signs that the federal Labor government is moving in that direction to fully legislate UNDRIP into Australian law, or not really?
No, there's been no indication of that at the federal level since the Voice to Parliament referendum outcome. The Labor Party at the national level has been very intentionally moving away from increased Indigenous rights. They see, because of the referendum decision, they see it as they see the public as not supporting that particular pathway forward, unfortunately. But the government has really pivoted away from Indigenous rights towards more pursuing or investing in Indigenous participation in mainstream economies. That's kind of the road that we're headed down now. But that's not to say that down the road they may revisit aspects of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, or potentially may look at Indigenous rights more broadly as a way to improve relationships between the state and Indigenous communities. Because right now they don't seem to have the answers or the willingness within government to pursue I won't say radical, but pursue some shift that would necessitate a much more comprehensive change.
Yes, yeah. Cheyenne has her hand up.
Yeah, hi there. I'm actually a guy, but that's okay.
Sorry, yeah, apologies.
That's okay. Thanks so much, Bart, for your presentation. I really appreciate that. And it was really informative. I help coordinate sustainability, First Nations partnerships, and climate change at Noosa Council. Late last year, we signed a commitment to the Kabi Kabi peoples. And I've been working on a relationship agreement and an implementation plan on our commitment with them since, and aim to develop a RAP in the next coming couple of years as well. It would be great to touch base with you, maybe get a copy of your slide deck, but run through some of our current approaches to get some advice from an expert on how we can improve and where we can do better on decision making and incorporating First Nations input.
Yeah, I'll be happy to be involved. I'll just put my email in the chat so you can email me directly.
Cool. Thanks, Bart.
Otherwise, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Bart? Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, and particular thanks to Bart for providing such a comprehensive and profoundly challenging, I think, insight into how local government works in Queensland. We hope to hear more about your research and to support any changes that we can, in terms of the ways that local governments operate you know, with, you know, in greater partnership with Indigenous councils and Indigenous communities and traditional owners, but also, you know, really engaging in that truth telling, which you've emphasised is really the first step to really driving, you know, real sustainable change. So thanks so much, Bart. We really appreciate your presentation today. And thanks very much to all of our audience for their interest and interesting questions.
Thanks, Catherine. And I'll provide my PowerPoint slides as well for anyone who wants to have them.
And we'll put the link up on the website. Thanks, Bart. That was
Thanks,
awesome.
Nez.